Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oja Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the show's list at harbingermedianetwork.com. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Victor's Children on the politics of war from Ukraine to Canada. And I'd just like to ask my two guests for this episode to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name's Dru Oja Jay. I'm the publisher of The Breach, and I'm the executive director of a community university television in Montreal. And germane to this conversation, I've co-written a book called Paved with Good Intentions about Canada's development NGOs abroad.
Yes. Hi, I'm Olena, and I am an editor at Midnight Sun, but also at Left East, and just published, with a lot of help from others and conversation with others, a piece called On the Frontier of Whiteness, on the war in Ukraine. And I'm a PhD candidate at York University, and I studied the post-socialist transition, or post-Soviet transition rather, and women's work.
And before we dig into the episode, I would like to just tell listeners that Midnight Sun magazine is currently running a fund drive. And like Olena, I'm an editor of Midnight Sun. So at midnightsunmag.ca, you'll find the articles that we've been publishing now for just over a year. And Midnight Sun tries to give articles quite a lot of editorial attention. So we try to help writers to develop their ideas and express them in the most effective and eloquent way that they can. We pay writers to the best of our ability. And so there's a cost associated with running this that might not be visible to people who are reading articles at Midnight Sun, both because we have to pay an editor on a part-time basis and because we pay writers. So anything that you can contribute on an ongoing basis through Patreon or as a one-off donation would be most welcome. You can just go to midnightsunmag.ca to support our fund drive.
I think David said it all, but I just want to add that we try to engage writers who are organizing, who are on the ground, who are activists and organizers, as I said. And so we try to support voices that maybe haven't been heard, haven't been forefronted as much. So that's really cool, I think. And our pieces so far have really engaged with radical thinking around transformation in Canada and beyond and globally. So please support us.
Yeah, we try to have a strategic focus to what we do. We want to explore the question of what is to be done in different ways, but we also publish poetry and other kind of reflective pieces on things that might be emerging in organizing and activist experiences. So please do what you can to support us. No amount is too small. So our topic today is the politics of war from Ukraine to Canada, and mainstream media in Canada and other Western countries is continuing to paint a very simplistic picture of the war in Ukraine as a war of good guys against bad guys, with brave, good Ukrainians fighting to defend their good democratic society against the armed forces of Putin's bad regime in Russia. Now, on Russia itself, on the March 2022 episode of Victor's Children, I discussed Russian society with Simon Pirani. So if you're interested in that, I suggest you check it out if you haven't heard it already. But today we're going to be talking about Ukrainian society, starting by talking about Ukraine before the war. And I should just say that for anyone who wants to follow up, there'll be links in the show notes to things that both Dru and Olena have written, but also other articles too. So I'd like to start with you, Olena. In your article on the frontier of whiteness, expropriation, war, and social reproduction in Ukraine, which was published on Left East, you wrote about several aspects of Ukrainian society before the invasion that are just generally not at all understood by people in the West. So can you start by talking about the neoliberal so-called reforms that have been inflicted on people in Ukraine over the past 3 decades?
Yes. So in the article, I really focused on 2014 onwards, but of course, the Ukrainian working people have experienced kind of the slow and depressing 3 decades of class decomposition, immiseration, and depopulation, which importantly, this whole process has shaped their new position, I think, as working class vis-a-vis Europe and to an extent North America, right, as cheap migrant labor, and that's kind of the focus of my piece. But of course, it was first the shock therapy reforms, and then the more sophisticated kind of institutional reforms, neoliberal reforms that have led to some very bad demographic indicators in Ukraine as part of like the overall post-Soviet space. So post-Soviet Ukraine's industrialized economy, public infrastructure, and skilled labor force underwent, I would argue, a period of primitive accumulation through the neoliberal shock therapy reforms, forming its own sort of flavor of the capitalist state that can be defined as neoliberal kleptocracy. And this term is not my own, of course. You can read both Volodymyr Ishchenko, but also Yulia Lyubchenko's work on this in a really good article from 2019. It's called Ukrainian Capitalism and Inter-Imperial Rivalry. They write that this new capitalist class was composed of neo-nomenclatura and capitalists in the making, you know, who came from the criminal political nexus and the Soviet Ukrainian Komsomol. But first of all, I guess I should sort of address what are shock therapy reforms. They are known to be kind of structural adjustment loans from financial institutions such as the IMF, international financial institutions, and with conditions that restructure the more state-led economies towards kind of a greater market imperative. So privatization of previously nationalized industry, resources, institutions, what we call precarization and impoverishment of the public sector, and public-private partnerships, and so on. And so let me emphasize, too, that it is not the withdrawal of the state from the market, this kind of simplistic, right? No, it's the restructuring of state institutions towards capital accumulation at the expense of households, social reproduction, and what we call like life making. But I want to say a little bit more that these shock therapy reforms in Ukraine, and of course in other post-Soviet states like Russia, but perhaps playing out a little bit differently. So these shock therapy reforms were about the restructuring, right, of the relationship between the political and the economic kind of state and capital. And I would emphasize them as primitive accumulation, so forced violent expropriation of working people. And the assumption is that neoliberalism kind of comes in a Western clean form, right? But in my view, that's a very false, and so the transitology studies, right? Transitioning from one to the other. I think it's a very false assumption. We find that both productive and established kind of accumulation under the legal form of contract between capital and free labor has always been accompanied by violent expropriation in the sphere of social reproduction, formulated in laws and public policies, right, by the state. So in this process, the Soviet state, I think, acted both as the object and the tool of primitive accumulation, where, as Marx writes, the law itself became an instrument of theft, you know? And the institutional infrastructure of the state, in a way, provided a subsidy to its capitalist successors, right? State-owned enterprises in the public sphere directly transformed into the kind of private sources of income, and I guess opposite to a view of like a disintegrating state that we kind of heard in the West, I think, but also, you know, back home, these kind of liberal views. Well, I think the state was eating itself from the inside actively, you know. So this materialized in things like foreign direct investment regulations and kind of uneven implications for accumulation by both domestic and foreign capital, creation of special economic zones, development areas that were prioritized, and also kind of state purchasing and abuse of procedure state asset embezzlement, and so on, right? So in practice, these were labor market reforms, pension reform, healthcare reform, education reforms. And, I can go on, in terms of occupational health and safety, for instance, deregulation to the point where accidents caused at work by working conditions where the employer was really responsible, no longer obliging the employer to pay the fine to the worker. So I think I'll stop there. But I can say more later, especially after 2014.
Yeah, I would just add, to Olena's sort of more nuanced analysis, I would just add some sort of big picture numbers. Like there were over 2 million people left Ukraine in the sort of post-Soviet period. I think up to 2.7 million people. There were, the Lancet found that, certainly hundreds of thousands of premature deaths in Ukraine resulted from the neoliberal restructuring and the shock therapy, and probably millions of premature deaths happened as a result. So you have this, and that includes sort of the infant mortality rates going up. So literally tens of thousands of dead children basically as a result of these neoliberal restructuring. So I don't think we can underestimate the sort of violence that was carried out in that post-Soviet period, and that was directly backed by Canada through the international institutions like the IMF and so on, and that those policies have been pretty much continuous since 89. So you really have a policy of violence on a mass scale toward people in Ukraine that's been ongoing for that entire period. I think that as the sort of backdrop to what sort of happens next is really important.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to what Dru has said in terms of the demographic, measures of well-being. That's what Godsey and Orenstein call these effects, right? That, of course, these reforms had especially negative impact on women, right? And kind of the decline of social citizenship, a part of which was the social wage and the introduction of market imperative economic insecurity, really resulted, like Dru said, in a dramatic decrease of life expectancy at birth. And, in 2014, the World Health Organization concluded that the health of people in the former Soviet countries deteriorated dramatically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the 2010 UNDP research paper also suggested that, there was an epidemic, the excess deaths in the former Soviet countries kind of reflected an epidemic of heart and circulatory diseases, as well as a dramatic increase in homicide and suicide among working age men. So these numbers are really kind of terrifying also that Dru brought up. But I think we need to also emphasize how the policy of cutting jobs in health, education, social services sector, which primarily employed women, they constituted, up to 80% of the total number of employees. Of course, this was freezing wages or recruitment, kind of part of these macroeconomic policy suggestions by international financial institutions. They are kind of responsible for the demographic decline and really impoverishment of working class people.
Could you focus a little bit on the question of who actually was responsible for these reforms, in the sense of to what extent are we talking international financial institutions, Western governments, the capitalist class in Ukraine? Because I think sometimes when people talk about this, only one aspect of that might be highlighted. So can we talk about how they all work together?
Yeah, I'll try. Well, I think that, yes, I think that we need to emphasize also as I was saying earlier, the active, primitive accumulation by the state of the state, in a sense. But as Ishchenko and Lyubchenko write in the piece, really it was also a fight kind of between different factions of, say, New Capital in Ukraine, right? But in their interaction with international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, but also lobby groups such as the European Business Association, what else? American Chamber of Commerce, sorry, and the Center of U.S.-Ukraine Relations, U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. Dru probably can say much more about Canada as well. And, recently, like according to leaked documents, and we can talk about this later on, about the labor law reform, right? That's kind of on the news now in Ukraine. But according to leaked documents, also since September 2020, the UK government, through the British Foreign Office and the UK aid and the UK embassy in Kiev, was funding and advising on the drafts of the new Ukrainian labor legislation. So these are drafts 5388 and 5371, which aimed at, like liberalization, further liberalization of the Soviet era labor law. So these are the kinds of actors involved in this transformation.
So my sense of it, and I'm curious how you would sort of characterize it, Olena, but is that you had the shock therapy that created these mass privatizations. You had some people in Ukraine who sort of became the oligarchs by gobbling up or finding investors and leveraging their positions to get control of these sort of formerly state-owned enterprises, and at sort of bargain basement prices. And then they became tremendously, sort of disproportionately politically powerful within the country. And I think it seems like this happened in parallel in Russia as well, which is pretty much, there's a direct line from that to Putin being, president for life, basically. But in Ukraine, you had the sort of privatization creates the oligarchs. The oligarchs are then sort of, have their own interests in terms of accumulating wealth and controlling the sort of political system. But they work sort of alternately in tandem with the sort of privatizing impulses of the IMF and the international financial institutions driven by the US mainly, who are sort of imposing this economic structure. So they're both benefiting from that and feeding into it, but at the same time, pursuing their own interests. And obviously there's now some sort of tension around the edges, is my understanding, is that they, because they benefit from such a high level of corruption in the country, and the IMF and, the EU and the other sort of international actors that are trying to turn Ukraine into this sort of respectable, capitalist, rational, investor-friendly state.
Yeah, as if that exists
are annoyed
anywhere.
with that level of corruption. But at the same time, they're sort of still pointed in generally the same direction. But I'd be curious to hear your sort of take on that.
Sorry, I was interrupting you in my anger. But I always get angry at these ideas of respectable liberal democracy. It's like, okay, does that really exist? I think that, again, we cannot really speak about, I think we cannot really speak about these pure forms versus mixed regimes versus, I think it's capital and the capitalist state in each kind of historical context, right? But nonetheless, very much playing a role within global capitalism. So just as today, say the EU or the US are trying to create a respectable, quotation marks, like capitalist class or state, and in Ukraine, it's they also who were facilitating, right, in relation and also just like in cahoots with the kind of fighting capitalist factions in Ukraine that really brought the system in practice in the first place, right? So it's a strange juxtaposition, I think, and dichotomy, this pure versus mixed forms, or good versus bad, or like corrupt or non-corrupt capitalism, I think this requires more study and more research. And where today, like, at what point does the West support kind of corrupt versions, and at what points it kind of fights against them or like challenges them. It's a very strange thing for me, and really makes me angry because again, I just think about the relationship between like sort of surplus value extraction versus like expropriation, and I think those two are never really far from each other.
Could you say something about migration from Ukraine in the years before the invasion, which again, I think many people in North America are not so familiar with?
Yeah, I think in like other Eastern Europeans in the 90s or like late 80s and 90s, a lot of Ukrainians, especially women, Ukrainian mothers and grandmothers, have been working as, migrant domestic workers, leaving their families behind, cleaning homes of richer Europeans and like Americans, Canadians, kind of doing a lot of social reproductive work, also sex work in the West. And, as I write in the article too, this was my mother too in Toronto when we arrived here in the early 2000s. But since 2014, there has been a dramatically larger number of Ukrainians kind of mobilized as cheap social reproductive labor, remitting much of their income to cover the gaps in state provision at home and compensate for the damage of war and militarization. So in 2020, the number of Ukrainians living abroad was estimated, I think, between over 2 million, almost 3 million people. So that's like maybe 13-16% of total employment in the country. And Ukraine is the world's 10th largest recipient of remittances. And in 2020, these formed almost 10% of the country's GDP. So, they bypassed like $19 billion in 2021. And remittances have contributed to about like 50-60% of the recipient household budgets. And in comparison to households that are not receiving remittances, people really have relied on remittances for education, for food. So really like just like surviving, but also in fact, filling the gaps of state provision that is lacking, or like housing, education, and so on. But so whereas in Ukraine, the costs of social reproduction have been offloaded onto the households that prepare workers to be sent abroad. In the EU countries, the arriving Ukrainian labor power is, in a sense, cost-free. It's paid for by the past labor of households like in Ukraine, right? And communities and infrastructure, but also its ongoing renewal in the EU or in Canada and the US as migrant workers is so cheap because a lot of them are excluded from state benefits and like social citizenship at large.
And parallel to then, as more working people in Ukraine are relying on the income from remittances, you have the militarization of Ukrainian society, which, Olena, you wrote about taking place since 2014 when civil war broke out in the east of the country. And I think the militarization has received even less attention than migration in mainstream media. So could you tell listeners a bit about what that's been like since 2014 up to the actual Russian invasion in 2022?
Yeah, I think that they are, as you've pointed out, like David, that they are, the militarization, neoliberal reforms are sort of married, here together. The militarization since 2014 has been coupled with neoliberal reforms, right? Like aimed at facilitating, I think, the growth of capital at the expense of the reproduction of working class households. And the state, since 2014, the state has really institutionalized dramatically lower costs of social reproduction. So, I traced how, in a sense, its militarization has been tied to austerity measures, displacing the burdens of resisting Russian aggression and kind of preparing the state for a very highly unequal process of Euro-Atlantic integration onto the households. So in a sense, it's like, well, we need to militarize and defend the country, therefore prices are going to go up, or therefore we're going to privatize more educational facilities, or we're going to close them down. Therefore, healthcare will become more like the healthcare reform, right? It'll become more expensive, less accessible, and so on. So the militarization it justifies, the sacrifice of the nation for the victory, and so on. So it's a really convenient way to dispossess more people, right? So the cost of national security spending quadrupled in the last decade, right? Again, women absorb, as I kind of emphasize always, is that the women absorb the cuts to the social wage and the public sector. Again, international financial institutions like the IMF have placed, very strict limits on social spending with, again, significant implications for women, like elimination of fuel subsidies, causing higher prices for gas, for heating, electricity, and transportation, cuts to spending on healthcare, on education, on child assistance benefits, and the major reform of the pension system. So starting in 2005, in 2015, the decommunization laws, which were sort of at the kind of, people would say, cultural and language level, right? But they also banned communist political parties and symbols, renamed Soviet-era cities, and etc. While at the same time, they were also extended, I would argue, to the kind of modernization and Europeanization of what little was left of the welfare state since the 90s shock therapy reforms. And of course, the Ukrainian constitution declares Ukraine to be a welfare state. So in a sense, these reforms have been unconstitutional, really, right? And Commons journal, Ukrainian journal, really good research, they have reported kind of on the 30 years of these neoliberal reforms since the fall of the Soviet Union. We can also include that link later on. But in comparison, say, to 2013, in 2016, the state cut spending on healthcare by 36%, over 36%, on education also over 36%, and on civil service by 30%. Like, these are significant cuts, right? And the economic reforms pushed by the IMF kind of accelerated rising inequality, of course, where 67% of Ukrainian households in 2021 characterized themselves as poor, for the first time. That's like almost 70%, right? And this is to the point where the UN Human Rights Council issued a report in 2017 on how austerity measures have pushed by the IMF are really affecting Ukrainian women's, human rights, in quotation marks again, as rights. So pretty significant changes, drastic changes for people. But maybe I also should speak a little bit about what has been happening in the Donbas region also. I'm not sure if you want to hear about kind of the violence and also the dispossession of the elderly people because of these borders, new borders drawn, and the militarization of the borders.
Maybe you could say something briefly about that.
Sure. So say in 2016, there was a strict control measure introduced by the Ukrainian government, which required internally displaced persons to register at an address in government-controlled territory and basically check in every month to maintain pension, bi-monthly to maintain pension eligibility. So if you lived on the separatist, your village or town happens to be on the separatist side of that Donbas, you have to travel basically every 60 days to the Ukrainian side in order to receive the Ukrainian pension, right? And these, like, the infrastructure for this travel, for these borders is just like horrifying. There were so many people who died. Standing under the rain, no bathrooms really provided, no facilities, long queues, without shelters. And this is only to get pensions that were about, $90 per month, right? And so the UN estimates that 400,000 people have lost access to their pensions since the 60-day rule was implemented in 2016. And the Ukrainian pension fund basically has accumulated a debt of 86 billion hryvnias, which is about $3.5 billion owed to pensioners who live in non-government controlled areas.
Thank you. Before we turn to talk about the politics as they've been playing out in the Canadian state, I just wanted to ask the question, if you could just say something about the way that the war itself in the last number of months has affected politics in Ukraine. And, Olena, you mentioned the labor law reforms that have been floated. So if you want to say something about that, that would be great. But just in general, to help people understand what political forces have been strengthened and which ones have been weakened inside Ukraine since the war began.
Yeah, when I was thinking about this question, my first thought was like, it's a simple answer. What political forces have been strengthened in Ukraine? Well, the forces of capital, maybe perhaps instead of speaking or observing kind of the rise of nationalism, right, and commenting on its implications, because every discussion on the left has been on Twitter, on Facebook, email threads, conferences, whatever, has been about that. I think it's better maybe to comment on how the war has become really prime context and opportunity for further neoliberal reforms. But I would like to make the case that it's not a rupture, right? It's war and all of a sudden, like these labor reforms, as I've already said, like it's not a rupture. Indeed, it's a continuity of neoliberal reforms before the invasion in February 2022, but also even before 2014. Okay, so in a sense, what is happening now? There's a proposed new labor law. It's called Bill 5371. I think mentioned it earlier, and it was actually originally registered in April 2021. So clearly, this is not because of Russia's invasion today. It's a year ago, and it's basically a wartime suspension of labor law, right? So the bill has been developed by a Ukrainian NGO, the Office of Simple Solutions and Results, which was set up by former Georgian President Michael Saakashvili, together with Ukrainian employers associations and US aid program. And the law basically is supposed to desovietize, decommunize, desovietize, whatever you want to use as your term, the outdated labor code, that now governs kind of Ukrainian labor relations, which was adopted in 1971. This is really draconian, really bad curtailment of employees' rights. In terms of sick leave or vacation pay, the working week increased from 40 hours to 60, shorter holidays. But moreover, it's basically those kind of small and medium-sized firms which have less than 250 employees would in effect would be basically removed from the existing labor law, and now covered by individual contracts negotiated with the employer. So more than 70% of the Ukrainian labor force workforce would be affected by this change, right? And at the same time, one very interesting point here is one of the more controversial ones is the ability to involve women in physically strenuous labor and work underground in mines, for example, which is currently both prohibited by the Ukrainian labor laws, but also could be a violation of the ILO organization 45th convention. And again, to bring this back to kind of the international or the global forces at play here, and perhaps gesture to some questions about imperialism and what that means in Ukraine today, and that maybe we need to think more about that. It's the British Foreign Office, as I said, was kind of embroiled in this scandal over advice and really pushing for this new labor legislation through Parliament. Well,
maybe we could turn now to talk about the way the war has affected politics in the Canadian state, and we can ask the same question about which political forces have been strengthened by the war. Dru, could you start us off on that?
Yeah, sure. I think, as you said earlier, the intense sort of polarization sort of views, toward the sort of Manichaean good guys, bad guys narrative is really the sort of dominant political theme. And I think it extends to, if you say anything that disagrees basically with the official U.S. Canadian sort of line, then you risk being accused of repeating Russian propaganda, basically. And at the same time, if you try to be selective in what you support among the Canadian state, like it's very difficult to, in terms of like weapons transfers or aid or anything like that. It's kind of an all or nothing deal. Like you either support it all or you're with the enemy. And so I think the sort of a key task is carving out space where we can actually just like think about things without sort of immediately falling into one of these two sort of categories. And in that context, the forces that have been sort of empowered by this are pretty clearly the military spending first and foremost. I mean, within Canada, certainly, within Europe to even greater extent, and to a massive extent in the US, you see these spikes in military spending, and most of that is going to like super expensive weaponry, much of which is just not relevant at all to the Ukraine conflict, and is more about creating this bigger military industrial complex and just funneling money to these forces. And then at the same time, you have oil companies. Obviously, you have massive increase in oil prices of late as pretty much a direct result of Putin's invasion. And so you have Suncor and other companies showing like tripled profits. So it's empowering them politically and financially. And then you have the sort of corporate price gouging and commodity speculation. That's also pretty much a direct result of a variety of sort of converging factors, but certainly the invasion is a big one of them. And so, yeah, consumer prices for basic needs, including housing, including food, and other sort of necessities, has gone up, which of course effectively disempowers financially and politically the people who are at the sort of bottom end of the economic pyramid, but empowers the sort of shareholder class and hedge funds and so on. And then, of course, I think within Ukraine, certainly, but I think that there's an echo of that here is that the sort of far right has been empowered as well, in the sense that there's sort of, you sort of see this kind of ongoing attempt to rehabilitate these sort of neo-Nazi groups as legitimate actors in one way or another, or to downplay their actual worldview. And I think that has an effect here. And you have, to an unknown extent, you have far right groups, probably sending over, participating in various ways in sort of mobilizing for the war, but also sending over people as volunteers, getting, I don't know what kind of military training. We don't know all the things going on behind the scenes, but it's safe to say that on a broad level, the far right has been here in Canada as well, sort of empowered to some extent, both financially and politically, by the conflict. So really, some of the worst actors and the people we'd least like to see empowered and subsidized are being empowered and subsidized.
Maybe I could just ask you to pick up on the thread about climate politics in relation to this. You mentioned Suncor, but any thoughts about the kind of broader implications about how these things will affect efforts to actually decarbonize and advance a climate justice agenda?
Yeah, it's a massive setback. I mean, I think if we had a strong left and a I think we would be able to say things like, are we too dependent on Russian gas and oil? And is that is Russia able to cause spiraling inflation and an economic recession? Maybe that means that we should have a international Green New Deal that creates massive infrastructure spending to move us collectively away from fossil fuel consumption. Maybe it means building millions of heat pumps and sending them to electrical heat pumps and sending them to Europe, so that some portion of their heating and cooling can happen through something other than natural gas. All these kinds of things could be proposals that could be on the table, but they're not I think it's really notable that they're not. And policymakers are reaching very quickly for, let's let's get oil wherever we can get it. Let's drill more at home and so on. Even though the oil companies seem reticent to do that because they're just enjoying their high prices. I think policymakers have, and the sort of people in power have really gravitated toward, we need more domestic oil supply, which is of course anathema to any kind of like the generational project that we're faced with of, reducing and very quickly eliminating most fossil fuel use. So yeah, it heads in the exact opposite direction. And there hasn't really been a strong reply, even from the climate movement, to say like, look, the solution to Putin having this much power and really the solution to stopping him from conducting this illegal, atrocious war is to, move the world off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. That really hasn't been raised, unfortunately.
And one other follow-up question for you, and that's about the response of the NDP, and maybe you could say something about Quebec Solidaire in Quebec if you have any thoughts about that. But just as the largest organizations identified with the left, what kind of a response we've seen there?
Yeah, I'll focus on the NDP because I'm more familiar with them. But, the NDP has been, I would say, since Sven Robinson was removed as the sort of foreign affairs critic, I think around, it must have been 05, 06, you really have had a series of foreign affairs critics with the NDP who have been, more or less in line with the foreign policy establishment in Canada. You haven't really seen them step out very much. And I think the notable exception was when the members against all odds passed a resolution in support of Palestine. And you saw the party sort of switch tracks a little bit on that, in line with public opinion, certainly. But that was a huge that was a decade-long, at least, fight to even get them to do that. But otherwise, if you look at Heather McPherson's sort of statements and her sort of predecessor statements, you see a lot of we should be doing more kind of stuff. Like even before Russia's invasion, you saw a lot of like, we should invest more in helping train the military in Ukraine. We should help. We should do these various things, and without a lot of critical capacity. Certainly not a lot of criticism of the military-industrial complex and the sort of the real horrors that unleashes. I mean, I think we just as a sort of mild digression, we have to just look at the news from the U.S. and with all these sort of mass shootings happening. That's a direct result of militarizing a society and empowering military contractors as like a primary mover of politics. The NRA was and gun culture was created to like fill the need for a market for all these firearms in between wars, and the sort of repeal of assault weapons bans or regulations and the political sort of allergy to any kind of regulation of weapons that's resulting in these just absolute horrors, in the US and to some extent in Canada, as a direct result of empowering those people. So when we talk about when we think about the policies that we're going to support with whatever power we have, I think we have to take that into account. The sort of increases in military spending and what a poison that is to our society, to our social fabric, to our political sphere, and everything. I mean, we can talk about the sort of subtleties of like, should we support this kind of weapons transfer to Ukraine or not support this other kind or whatever. I think that there are really important discussions to be had there, but it's just not on the table institutionally in Canada. Although if you go down the line, you'll see, like, if you look at CUPE, or some of the big unions have statements basically saying, we support de-escalation, we support measures toward peace. I mean, we can debate whether that's even, to what extent that's possible, but you have a bit of that, and certainly around the fringes of the NDP, certainly not people in any kind of official critic position are taking like some decent positions. There's been criticism of international financial institutions and their orientation toward Ukraine, certainly from someone like Nikki Ashton. You've seen a few other groups sort of be critical in various ways and maintain an independence of thought, which is encouraging. But the core of the party is is not that.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Olena?
Yeah, I think one of the toughest questions is if we take ourselves seriously in the US and Canada in terms of our calls to defund or to abolish the police, then how do we connect this part of our organizing and our even normative orientation, right? And critique to increased military spending? What happens after the fact, after the war? And how, if we are internationalists, how will this increased militarization, in Ukraine, but also by these arms companies, basically, but also in the US, Canada, and Germany, how will that play out for other movements for self-determination, both against settler colonialism here, but also elsewhere, like in Yemen or Palestine and other conflicts? So I think this is one of the toughest questions for leftists today.
Thanks for that. I do want to say just something briefly about what has happened in terms of activity in support of Ukraine within the Canadian context. And it seems to me that it's been generally dominated by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress as an organization, certainly in Winnipeg, when the rallies have happened. That's been pretty clear. Now, people listening may or may not know that the Ukrainian Canadian community has historically been divided, or was historically divided on a very clear kind of left-right political basis. And the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is a right-wing organization, but it claims to be the representative of all Ukrainian Canadians. It's much larger and more influential than the remnants of the left in the community, represented by the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, which in the past historically supported the USSR. Although, as an aside, I'll mention there were also, from the late 1960s, anti-Stalinist left-wing Ukrainian Canadians active. And I'll put an article in the show notes about some of their experience. But the UCC has certainly been, I think, very successful in positioning itself around shaping whatever kinds of popular responses there are going to be, people who are moved to do something in support of Ukraine. And so you had rallies where you would have, right-wing Tory politicians speaking along with others. And here in Winnipeg, when people attempted to chant "No War," so people chanted "No War," they were drowned out by people chanting "No Fly Zone," which at that time was the call that was coming from UCC, or at least from a lot of right-wing nationalists, which of course amounted to a call for Western military intervention directly into the war. So that, I think, has been pretty clear. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any kind of significant visible left solidarity activity that's been able to have much of an impact, as far as I can see, in terms of trying to give people who want to do something to support Ukrainians under attack an alternative. Let's move to the question of the left in so-called Canada, because as I see it, we have a war of Ukrainian self-defense in Ukraine, led by a neoliberal government against Russian imperialism. But then that war is entangled in the conflict between Western imperialism, led by the US and organized through NATO, and Russia on the other side. So here we have Western ruling classes siding with Ukraine and trying to use the war to weaken Russia, all with an eye on the West's more powerful rival, China. So in that context, then, what should the left in so-called Canada be doing in relation to the war and the politics around the war here?
So in terms of what the left could or should be doing, I think that there are a lot of nuanced positions, regarding things like, weapons transfers and so on that we can and should sort of take positions on. But I think the way that the left can be powerful, the way that the left can exert itself in a way that is consequential, is to have a very, very clear and unambiguous position that pushes in a particular direction, and that has a lot of moral force behind it. I think in the context of Ukraine, the thing that I would really focus on would be the debt that Ukraine has been saddled with. Not certainly since the beginning of the war, but going all the way back to 1989. And the sort of odious conditions and the violence that has been implemented with that debt as the sort of key leverage for those those just horribly destructive policies. And I think the more we can sort of educate people about how devastating these economic policies have been in Ukraine over those decades, the more we can sort of use what I think is fundamentally like an upwelling of goodwill toward people in Ukraine to bring people closer to the reality of what's going on. So instead of it just being like waving the flag and standing for Zelensky or whatever it is, like instead of that, saying like, okay, well, if you like let's take that seriously. Let's really care about people in Ukraine and let's drop the debt and let's never do that to any other country ever again. And then that would create a sort of stepping stone, in my view, to something bigger. Like, okay, let's get off fossil fuels so that we can completely disempower the petro-oligarchic regime in Russia that's driving this whole thing, and create a world where we don't have those kinds of wars, whether they're started by Russia or Saudi Arabia or the US or Canada for that matter.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think that point about there being a lot of, genuine popular sympathy that we need to relate to. And that the way that the campaign around the debt would actually provide a really good way of doing that, because it allows us to, expose, as people learn more about what's going on, why is the Canadian government not supporting this, right? What kind of questions does this raise about people who claim to be friends of Ukraine at this time? That kind of campaign would have a lot of potential. But as you say, for the left to actually have an influence that's disproportionately large, it has to start with clarity. And there does have to be a clarity of ideas about understanding the situation. And I think that for quite understandable reasons, people have not been focused on understanding Russian imperialism, right? If you're in this part of the world, and so some sections of the left, I think, have been not sure how to respond, precisely because of focus previously solely on the imperialism that we're directly, living under, and not thinking about how it's part of global capitalism, which has now more than one imperialist center, if you like. So I think that there's a connection between a lack of clarity on that side of things and our relative ineffectiveness, although it's of course more broadly connected to the weakness of the left. But I do think that analytical clarity is one part of the problem. Olena, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mostly agree. And I think that this is a really good way of like the sort of canceling Ukraine's foreign debt is a real good way of looking at Ukraine's self-determination in a real sense, like expanded beyond the liberal use of self-determination, which was, like a very revolutionary concept, before in the early 20th century, but it would really bring it back to the material, real material kinds of effects on people's lives, right? Not just kind of at the level of liberal democracy. So this would also include a critique of the capitalist state in Ukraine, I think, and the way in which it has dispossessed the Ukrainian peoples as well, before the war and during the war, and continues to. I think this is a very important part of this conversation. At the same time, there should have been an arms embargo on Russia. And this whole time throughout, since 2014, of course, all kinds of trade has been, continued between the Western government states and Russia in terms of the military as well. So I think that's an important one that hasn't really been floating around. Like I haven't really heard much on this front. So, and then of course the fossil fuels question, the green transition, which would really challenge the European states as well and their dependence on Russia and their relationship with Russia, right? And at the same time, I think we need a better, as you said, David, just now, a better understanding of Russian imperialism in relation to, say, the US empire of global capital, and understanding that the Russian state really is becoming, has fascistic tendencies, let's put it that way today, and they're growing, and it's supporting all kinds of horrible regimes around the world, both in the global north and global south. including like the Wagner group people waging wars, etc., all over the world, right? So I think that we need a rethinking of Russian imperialism today in terms of research, like at the level of like sort of the academy, the thought, but also I think in terms of it's somewhat neo-colonial in some ways tendencies and relations in the global South. And so there needs to be, I think, in Canada, what I've encountered during this last few months is on the left, and especially older, people on the Canadian left who are really struggling to understand that even Putin's regime today and Putin's Russia today is a rupture from the Soviet past. And however critical we are of the Soviet past, nonetheless, it's an even further, like it's a rupture. And I think for a lot of people, it's a continuity. And somehow he's presented as this defender of anti-colonial, anti-Western imperialism struggles. And I think we really need to challenge this idea over and over. And I've been trying to do that. So yes, so critique of Russian imperialism is very important. Yeah.
Yeah, and as part of a broader challenge to the kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend politics,
Exactly.
which Barnaby Rain talked about on an earlier episode of Victor's Children. Any other ideas for the left in terms of, if left forces were stronger, what kind of things would we want to do in the situation? And I think it's worth asking that question because if people can't even imagine, if people have not known a stronger left, it's hard to imagine what the left might do, right? If we were in a better place than we are. So certain ideas just don't occur to people because they've not experienced the left doing things that we could do if we were stronger. And so, if we were stronger on the left, what kind of things would we be able to do or what we would want to do around something like this war?
Yeah, I mean, I think to talk about being strong on the left, you have to talk about how to build, mass organizations that sustain themselves over time, beyond a particular horizon of, mobilization or protest or political campaign or whatever. And that's tremendously difficult. And I think, when you think about how to do that, I think the way that one does that, beyond the sort of subcultural or the sort of congenitally activist among us, is to have a direct impact on people's lives, whether that's changes in policy, changes in wages, changes in, or even a nourishing cultural and social life. Like it could be any one of those things, but establishing any kind of foothold in the context of constant social fragmentation and instant appropriation of capitalism has proven to be a very, very difficult task, and we're still working on that. But all that to say that foreign policy is even further from any of those things, because it's not really something, unless you're in the military or unless you work in an NGO or something, it's not something that that most people experience directly. And so our experience of foreign policy is mediated through, the media, through corporate journalism, through official statements by governments, and so on. And so I think the challenge when we're trying to create popular positions, counter-hegemonic positions about foreign policy, is that you have to cut through all that stuff. And that means at the very least, a very strong independent media and the capacity for independent researchers to really understand things and to work things through, and then to crystallize that at a sort of institutional level, whether that's unions or mass organizations or parties or whatever. You have to have that ability to have a discussion and change people's minds and have a debate where people shift or come to some kind of consensus, or at least a common denominator position, and then express that collectively. And yeah, it's very hard to see places where that happens. I mean, you have some unions taking, as I said before, positions, but is that the result of mass discussion in union locals? I don't think so. I think that's probably a discussion in a boardroom somewhere in Ottawa. And so it's a tremendous challenge, but I think there's still a lot more we could do. Even I don't know, if 100 people got together and were like, I'm going to spend a few hours a month on a Drop the Debt campaign, I think that would have a tremendous impact on discourse in Canada. I think that even something as small as that, even a commitment if it was well coordinated and had sort of clear actions around it, you could really shift a lot of people's perspectives and create a shift in how we think about solidarity with Ukraine and Ukrainians. So even in our weakened state, I think there's a tremendous amount we could do.
Last word to you, Olena.
I think I agree with all of that. I think there needs to be more exchange between the left here in Canada and Ukraine, and like in the most plural sense of Ukraine and Canada, so all kinds of positions and more debate and like more exchange. And I think that, like being an immigrant myself, of course, I think that there's a lot of methodological nationalism here in Canada on the left, like really a concern with like the welfare state restructuring, maybe the American empire, and that's it, And I maybe this is not very generous of me, but I feel like there needs to be more of an engagement in terms of understanding why the war in Ukraine matters for Canada, for instance, or for struggles for self-determination elsewhere or here or in the US, and conceiving of capitalism as global and not just within the boundaries and borders of what we call Canada.
Well, I think that was excellent. Thank you both so much. This is even better than I thought it would be. So I think that's a great note to end on. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.